Mamie Phipps Clark was a revolutionary psychologist who studied racial influences of segregation in young children. She was born on April 18, 1917, and died August 11, 1983. She was born and raised in the town of Hot Springs, Arkansas, by her father, a physician, and her mother, a homemaker. Clark herself described her time in elementary and middle school as being enjoyable on all accounts, even with segregation, because she had always simply enjoyed school. Her childhood was just fine, in her words, and she doesn't remember any specific point in which she really felt hopeless for her future. Her high school years are undocumented, but we can assume they were mostly the same. Clark's years in university is where her life began to lead to the research that made her well-known in civil rights history. Clark began with many scholarship opportunities to many well-known universities and chose to go to Howard. Between 1934 and 1938, she majored in math and minored in physics. In Howard, she met Kenneth B. Clark, another man of color who was majoring in psychology. They later married, and Kenneth convinced Clark to go back and get a psychology degree because of her interest in child development. She caved and ended up being one of the first black women to get a PhD at Columbia University in 1943. With her PhD, Clark's research focused on racial bias consciousness in young children within the school system, and a lot of her research was conducted in the 1940s, which is where the civil rights movement really began to shine. One of her most important pieces of research is known as the doll test, where Clark and her husband worked together to test over 250 black children within segregated and non-segregated schools between the ages of 3 and 7. They were presented with 2 dolls, one black and one white, and asked to pick one based on a series of questions. For questions such as pick the doll that looks nice or pick the good-looking doll, the large majority picked the white doll. When asked pick the ugly doll or pick the bad-looking doll, the same large majority picked the black doll. When asked to identify which doll looked most like them, many children became upset, some even storming out of the room or refusing to pick one. All of these tests, Clark concluded in her paper on the topic, confirmed that internalized racism was in the large majority of children, but the children within non-segregated schools found it easier to identify with their race, even if they felt it wasn't the good one. Other than the very important doll test, Clark worked in many child development centers before opening her own in 1946, called the Northside Center for Child Development in New York. This center helped many children find education outside of their schools that were absolutely necessary to gaining an educated future. Another one of Clark's widely known involvements is the use of her doll test research in the Brown v. Board of Education case to prove the effects of school segregation on black children. This was the first time that social science research was used in a U.S. Supreme Court case. Her doll test was one of the major pieces of evidence used to prove the act of segregation unconstitutional, and according to documentation, Kenneth B. Clark actually attended 3 out of the 5 cases where the children were present. Mamie Phipps Clark was key in psychological research during the civil rights movement, and to this day is a great role model for girls of color in the scientific field who wish to change the world in some way using their field to their advantage.